Well, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Maggie Ling. I'm the president of Oregon ITE. We're pleased to present you today's workshop on data analytics. It is hosted by Oregon ITE and the ITS Subcommittee. Before we get started, I have a few IT announcements I'd like to make. In case you haven't heard, the 2021 ITE International Western and Mountain District meeting that was originally planned to be held in Portland in July is going virtual this year due to the pandemic. But we hope you join the virtual conference. I'm sure it will provide a great platform for ITE members and non-ITE members to social with each other. Oregon ITE has an open position. We are looking for a co-chair for the sustainability subcommittee. If you are interested in joining Oregon ITE or volunteer on this subcommittee, please send an email to myself, and we would happy to talk more about what this position entails. Also, our Oregon ITE scholarship is currently accepting applications until May the 31st. If you know any students that are in Oregon universities and are interested in transportation field, this is a great opportunity that we offer to both undergraduate and graduate students. With that, I'm going to move to Imana to announce our upcoming events.
Hi, I am Imana. I'm one of the co-chairs for the ITE ITS Subcommittee, and we do have some fun upcoming events. Not just this one, we have one in May. That's going to be about ODOT, ITS, and I-205 tolling, the adventures of the tolling world. And it will be by ODOT's own Chi Mai and WSB from Matt Dolta. They will provide an overview and a technical analysis approach for the groundbreaking project. And then in June, because one event is not enough, we're going to have a Sensorama 2.0. It will include topics in ITS innovation in micromobility, bike and pedestrian innovations such as countdown bike signal heads, and last but not least, wrong way driving prevention for freeways. Now to today's event, because today's event is going to be great too. Let's talk about the agenda. First, we will have presentations from, I forgot to mention, we should really thank our sponsors. We wouldn't be able to do this without them. So thank you very much for sponsoring Oregon ITE and the Oregon ITS subcommittee. It means a lot to us. You'll see we have all. Now on to the agenda. The first we will be presenting is StreetLight Data, followed by a break. We'll do questions after presentations, and then we'll do a break after that, followed by urban logic, and ending with a presentation on RIDIS and INRIX by ODOT's engineers.
So our first presentation today is going to be on StreetLight Data. Our speakers are Matt Pettit from StreetLight Data and Amanda Deering from DKS Associates. So we're going to do about 35 minutes of presentation and then about 10 minutes of question and answer starting at about 1:40, and then we'll move into a break at about 1:50. So our speakers today, Amanda Deering is a transportation engineer at DKS Associates in Portland, where she focuses on travel demand modeling, corridor operation studies, and data analysis. She has worked with data sets from multiple big data and passively collected data providers for several planning projects in the region. Today, she is sharing her experience using StreetLight Data to inform the Vancouver TSP update. And I lost my script. Bear with me a second. Matt has 9 years of experience working on interdisciplinary teams across government, engineering and consulting, and data software vendors within and outside the transportation industry. Before joining StreetLight Data as a solutions engineer, Matt helped Virginia DOT operationalize the first ever state-level project prioritization program using multimodal accessibility as a factor. Matt holds an MS in civil engineering from Northwestern University, focusing on transportation systems analysis and planning. And with that, we'll go to Amanda.
Thank you, Anna, for the introduction. Hopefully you can see my presentation slide, not the presenter view. I'm going to take that as a yes. Okay, thank you everyone for coming to listen to this talk today. I'm going to be talking first about the applications of StreetLight Data that I used for the Vancouver TSP project, do a little intro on both of those, and then after the examples, Matt is going to talk more about the StreetLight product itself and some of the details behind the data. So I'm sure some of you may be already familiar with passively collected data or even StreetLight data, but just as a brief introduction before we get into the applications, StreetLight Data is one of the many vendors that provides anonymized, aggregated, passively collected data. And this data can be from GPS in vehicles, cell phone, location-based data. All of that is used to answer our regional questions that we couldn't otherwise answer, because your device, like your cell phone, is tracking you the whole day, and it gives you a cloud of waypoint data like shown in my little 1, 2, 3 figure. It starts out as a bunch of points, but then can be linked to a specific trip, aggregating different origin and destination patterns. And this data is constantly being collected, so we have it historically and currently. So this is the type of data I'll be talking about today and how it can be applied to planning level projects. The project application that I'm going to be using is for the Vancouver TSP update. So this was Transportation System Plan. We used this data to look at the existing conditions, 2019 conditions that is, since we didn't want to have the COVID-19 impacts in our study, but we were able to use StreetLight data to answer a bunch of major questions the city had about how people are traveling within their city by all modes, bike, ped, freight, and passenger car. And then in addition to that, we have the bonus of being able to look at a before and after of COVID impacts. Since this data is always being collected, we already have a before to compare to the after of 2020. So before we get into it, I wanted to go over some questions that the city had, because at this point, they really didn't have a lot of experience working with this data, but I knew there were a lot of questions we could answer with it. So these questions go beyond just the classic, what are the OD patterns in the city? We can also look at specific regional patterns, trips using major gateways such as freeways or bridges like the I-5 and the I-205 bridge. We can talk about different modes. So how are the freight patterns different from passenger car? What does bike and pedestrian activity look like? And then looking more into the specifics, like looking at key corridors in the city. What does travel look like there? What are the speeds? Where are the congested areas? How is access used along these corridors? There's a lot of questions that we were able to answer with this one data set. And in addition to that, like I mentioned, we looked at some COVID-19 impacts. So these are all the questions that we set out to answer, and I'm going to be showing you a selection of those applications. The first one is the basic OD pattern. This is showing the city split into 10 different zones that we set as origins and said what % of trips in the AM and PM peak hours are starting from these zones. So you can see where the top origins are in the city. And then we also give a magnitude of about how many trips for the AM and PM are being taken within the city. So this helps us with the overall look, and then we can dig a little deeper into what these patterns mean. So we can also look at flows between the zones. So we split the city into downtown, central, and East Vancouver. And on an average weekday, we looked at the estimated number of trips that were going through the city. You can see a lot of these trips stay within the zone they started in, but there are also trips that are traveling all the way from East Vancouver to downtown, probably for commuting in 2019. And there's also trips going to and from the central zone from each of the outside zones. So this gives another comparison to see what are the overall travel patterns. But this is just looking within the city, and we can also look at trips that didn't start and end within the city, ones that passed through. So the next example is looking at regional travel. We looked at 5 gateway zones along the major freeways, so I-5, I-205, and SR-14. And you can see that really there's a pretty even usage for the 2 bridges when we're looking at trips on an average weekday that start outside the city and either pass through or end in the city. That was an additional finding. And then to build on top of this, we wanted to see how that compared to freight travel, because those patterns using the major freeways might be a bit different. So this table compares basically the past 2 figures showing the passenger car trips within the city and passing through the city versus what that looks like for freight trips. So for trips starting and ending within the city, that comprise 74% of the car trips versus less than half of the freight trips. So obviously more freight trips are passing through using those major freeways and commercial corridors. In addition, you can see a slight preference for I-5 with the freight trips, which makes sense as that is another key through route, whereas 205 eventually connects back in to I-5 and really is used more for access to the city of Vancouver. Beyond the origin destination travel patterns, we also looked at speed data, which is something that you can get from this passively collected data. The city has a set of key corridors they're interested in. Those are the ones highlighted here, and we split them up into segments. So you can see how the PM peak hour travel speed changed along the segments. And this was used to help identify which corridors may be falling below the city standard, and also identify where maybe there are some streets that experience no congestion, and we could think about how to better use that street like roadway allocations. So you can see 18th Avenue and 167 2nd Avenue are the 2 green segments here. They stand out as really being not congested at all in the PM peak period. Again, this is 2019 data because we're trying to assess the existing conditions before any pandemic or work from home impacts. But in addition to just looking at speed on these corridors, we can also look at estimated volumes and level of usage on the corridors. So in the next figure, I have highlighted 5 segments where there was a lot of on and off activity. So comparing the number of people who went all the way, traveled the whole length of the corridor, as opposed to people who got on and off, maybe going to a driveway, going to a business, or just taking another route. These 5 corridors showed a lot of access and a lot of on and off activity, which could be indicators, A, of how the corridor is used, and also if there are any safety issues with the amount of driveways, people getting on and off. These are not through corridors. When we looked at all of the roadway segments here, the average was about 20% of trips traveled the entire length, as opposed to getting on and off at some other point in between. But for the highlighted segments, it was less than 5%. So definitely seeing a lot of activity along those corridors. Now, a lot of these big data sources, the focus is on vehicles, passenger car, freight vehicles, and there isn't a lot of bike and ped data out there, but StreetLight has been able to separate out the pedestrian and bicyclist modes for their product. And so for this assessment, we wanted to see just baseline where the ped and bike activity was in the city, because it wasn't something that was well known based on, you know, a handful of counts that had been taken in the past. So this really gave us an opportunity to explore something we hadn't looked at. And unlike the passenger car data, which seems kind of obvious when you look at the patterns, it's what we expected, the ped and bike data is a little bit different because we don't have as much data, so we don't know what to expect. This figure is showing the city split up into those same 10 zones I showed you before, but this time showing amount of ped and bike activity within each of these zones. And because ped and bike trips tend to be on the shorter side, a lot of these trips stayed within this larger zone. And from other data, we know that 30% of Vancouver commutes are less than 5 miles. And from the StreetLight data, we can tell the average trip length for these bike trips ranges up to 4 miles. So there's a big potential for potentially shifting from driving commutes to biking commutes. The average, the overall average passenger car trip length for all trips within the city was 6.5 to 9 miles, which is really pretty low when you think about it. Unless you're crossing major corridors or freeways, a lot of those probably could have been made by other modes. So if we look a little deeper into this, because maybe this is too high level, you say, okay, 16% of people bike or walk downtown, but where are they actually walking and biking? We were able to look at block groups, so the census block group activity, to identify where are some of the top biking zones. And the pedestrian map looked pretty similar to this one, but this just highlights the top 5 zones, and you can see where those are in Vancouver. And they sort of match up to some commercial areas like the Vancouver Mall, the downtown area, which makes sense. And then the Columbia Tech Center to the east was also a top bike activity location. So we are able to dig a little deeper and see where those peak bike and ped usage areas are and what might be attracting people to that area. So after this, I want to highlight a couple of the COVID-19 queries we did. This isn't going to be a full extensive presentation on those impacts, but just to highlight a few of the queries we did to look at the work from home impacts. The first one is looking at change in bike activity during COVID-19. So this compares an average of the year 2019 to April through October of 2020, basically waiting for the data to stabilize a little bit at the end of March, looking April through October 2020, which is at the time was the most current data we have. And this graphic shows where the increases in bike activity were in red and orange. And overall, some things to note is that 65% of these block groups showed an increase in bike activity. So bike activity was up during COVID-19, work from home time in 2020. And another key finding was that although AM and PM bike trips either stayed the same or declined, probably due to less commuting, midday trips actually saw a huge increase at 18%, which leads me to believe that more people are either going out on recreational trips or trips within their neighborhood, running errands midday. We saw an increase in that activity from this data. And then my last example takes a little more to explain, but basically the intent was to use the commute data and the trip type data that StreetLight has to see if we could identify essential workers or essential trips. So the StreetLight data will also tell you where they think home-based work trips are occurring. So where trips start at a home location and end at a work location. And so in this case, we tested for the 2 blue zones circled, if those are our destinations, so our work destinations, where are the homes that people are starting from? And the red zones in this case indicate an increase in proportion of those commuters who are commuting to the blue zones, where green indicates a decrease. So what this is trying to show is that those red zones in the east or the northern part of the city, that's where commute trips were still taking place in 2020, even when there were some major work from home restrictions in place. So the intent was to help the city identify where some of their essential workers were, and maybe where are some regions that could really benefit from some projects if those people are always going to be needing to commute to work. And then there are always a lot more questions that we didn't get to answer, but I hope that this showed a good overview of the variety of queries you can run in StreetLight and the variety of questions you can answer. It goes beyond just the typical origin and destination. And for that, I'm going to turn it over to Matt so that he can share some more details about the product and how we get here to the examples that I've shared today. So thank you, and take it away.
Thanks, Amanda. Let me share my screen. Amanda, can you see my screen?
Let me escape.
Yes, we can.
Yes.
Okay.
No, we can.
I'm trying to get the GoToWebinar thing out of my. Okay, I'm just going to drag it down. Okay. Yeah. So thanks, Amanda, for that great presentation. Hopefully now you have all the questions, kind of like, how does this happen? How do we get here? So hopefully we can answer those questions with this presentation. As we thank for the introduction as well, I work for StreetLight across the West Coast, although I am located locally here in Portland, Oregon as well. So I just wanted to add that. So really, I wanted to give today a pretty broad kind of overview, more of using big data sources, location-based data sources as a way, this kind of shift to additional ways to collect transportation data. And, I think this kind of shift to collecting data in alternative ways also aligns with a change in transportation as, people are commuting differently, they're traveling differently, there's different modes, scooters, e-bikes, you name it, people are using them. And what's great about the collecting data through cell phones and what I'll talk about in terms of location-based services, that cell phone is a mode agnostic device in that it doesn't matter what mode that you're taking, most likely you have your cell phone attached to you. And it's great for starting to understand this sea of change that's happening within our city. So in terms of the data sources themselves, StreetLight currently uses 2 data sources, which you're seeing across your screen right now. This is kind of a day in the life of big data in San Bernardino. You're seeing both the commercial GPS data that's coming from fleet management vehicles. This is using INRIX data that we ingest. And then you also have in purple personal devices, which are cell phone location-based services data. So every month we ingest about 40 billion anonymized location records. Privacy is obviously one of the top concerns and priorities that we have as well. So in terms of a little kind of deeper dive into the data itself, and I think in this whole realm of data looked differently 5-10 years ago. A lot of times before it was using cell phone tower data, and now we're getting down to using actually the cell phone app data through location-based services. So one of the big things to mark there is that you increase your accuracy and precision of your location. So the spatial precision and coverage is about 5 to 25 meters. So when you look at that donut hole on the right, compared to like cell phone tower data that we used to ingest, that was about 300 to 1,000 meters. So not only is this more accurate, but it really tells a story of what can we use the data for, right? So before the cell phone tower data was great for regional travel demand models and just in terms of understanding people traveling these kind of vast distances. But now if you're thinking about 5 to 25 meters, that's really smaller than a city block. So if we can get down smaller than a city block, that really changes the landscape and the use cases that we can use big data for. Now we can understand things like speed on roadways, which Amanda touched on. What route are people using? And in terms of the other pieces, temporal precision, this can get down to looking at things like weekends versus weekdays, 1 hour, time increments, 15-minute intervals. And then one of the big things as well is, what's great is that we can archive this data. So our data goes back to 2014, and especially with this pandemic that we're in, it allows us to really understand, one, what were the normal commuting patterns and travel patterns back in 2019, but also how are things changing? So the need for more data in terms of, every month is looking different. So the ability to get this data on a monthly basis becomes more and more important as we move forward. In terms of the sample size, I'll kind of have a whole section to talk about that. So we'll touch on that later. And really, this is a very brief overview of everything. I wanted to hit on a few things, but there's definitely a lot of information to follow up after. So in the world of processing the big data, we start with that location-based information, but it's not just that we use in terms of, well, it's not good enough just to know that a cell phone's flying across your city, but you really want to get contextual information. What roadway are they using? What census block are they coming from or going to? Where's their, what neighborhoods do these devices reside in? What are their demographics based on, what neighborhoods they're coming from? And then process this data in terms of actually understanding what mode people are taking. So we use training data from bike and pedestrian cell phone apps and other revealed preference surveys to then take that mode agnostic data and turn it into these mode specific metrics. Because really where we see ourselves in the industry is, taking this messy big data, being able to process it the same way, in every city, every state across the entire country, so that everyone in the industry can be talking the same language. And when you're accessing the metrics, you're accessing these typical metrics such as, ADT, MADT, speeds, trip lengths, you name it. But what I wanted to focus on today was really this kind of processing of the data, because I think in order to leverage it and get the most use of it, it's really important to understand kind of the underlying processes. And I think as traffic engineers, everyone really appreciates that. So in kind of a brief high-level overview, really, what we do when we take this location-based services data is that we have these waypoints, as Amanda was showing, but you don't want to access these waypoints that are flying over the Columbia and Willamette River. You want to actually understand the routed trips. So we apply a routing algorithm to get all of our waypoints to actual routed paths that you can query. So in terms of the data and the sample size we start with and that we end is, those are two different stories. And I think in terms of using big data in general, it's really important to understand, sample size you can define, 20 different ways. So I'm sure that was, a question that Amanda got when she presented the data to the city. What is the sample size? How many people are we capturing? There's a lot of different ways to actually represent this information. So we can say, we had, StreetLight has 110 million usable devices in our current sample. We have 1.5 billion trips analyzed in January 2020. But it's like, it's really like, okay, is that high? Is that low? Who really knows, right? The only really way to understand the sample size is for a specific project, which we always aim to do and we provide. But in terms of this process, it's really not, if you might think of, this industry is not really in its, infancy anymore, in that there's some maturity in terms of we're not just scraping data, right? So we're continually deduplicating devices, removing devices with infrequent pings. And that if we don't see consistent pings across a city, across a region, then we don't turn that into a trip, because as a transportation professional, if you can't understand, again, the waypoints of someone, how they got from A to B, then that information may not be that helpful. So it's not really helpful that if StreetLight is processing that data. So there is a huge data cleansing process. This also includes the quality of the apps and devices that we use. So we are always trying to, again, achieve the maximum number of high quality trips in our sample size. It's also working with our suppliers. We're not, I think, we always also hear that, the industry is like, what if there is no more location-based data? And that's, who knows what will happen in 5 years, but rather StreetLight's, approach is more that, again, we're data agnostic. We're always continuing to find the best data sources to make these, high quality trips, these useful devices that you can actually get trip and traveler metrics from. And so I really want to focus on kind of the project sample size, because it's always kind of, it's very ambiguous when you talk about those types of metrics across the country. But really it's, okay, what about the city of Vancouver? What about, the I-5 bridge over the Columbia River? And really, the sample size does vary by time, data period, and which I'll talk about. But for every project that you run, we'll share the, the sample of devices and trips that actually contributed to your analysis. And really, it is a different way of approaching data collection. And I think we always run into this and kind of the, obviously, as transportation professionals, we have current methodologies and approaches, guidelines that we follow, whether it's, going to get a, 40-hour queue counts for my particular project, and I use those. I have my equations that I can input the data into my, micro simulation modeling. Whereas StreetLight is a different approach in that, while traditional counters may look at all people over a few days, big data is really just more of an approach of many people for all days, right? We're not capturing every single person, but when you look at let's look at, a school day in the fall on Tuesday through Thursdays. Now we're still going to be collecting a lot of people, but I can't compare the two. So you can't necessarily compare one day of going out and comparing 100% of the counts to, big data looking at that same day. So I know there's a lot of work by some consultants that are kind of looking at this, like, well, what is the day-to-day variation of traffic, and how can maybe big data fill the gaps that we're not seeing? But if you were to look at one particular location, this road with 10,000 ADT, that's about 3.6 million trips. If we look at how many trips did StreetLight see, we saw about 250,000. So we're seeing, we're collecting more trips than you might do in a 48-hour period. So again, if you're looking at, what does a typical day look like, typical weekend, you're still being able to use a lot of trips to deduct what your findings are. But there is this, in terms of representativeness, what's our, sample size across the board? How do you count for low sample areas? There are a lot of different normalization processes that we go through. So one is the population adjustments. So actually looking to see what our penetration rates are in a particular area, and then adjusting our trips in those areas based on those factors. Big data is not a shift to only using, never going back to using physical infrastructure for counting traffic and understanding transportation, but rather ourselves, we use more than 10,000 permanent loop counts across the country to empower our metrics and analytics. So, and this is really a story of that. And this is from our white paper, which you can go on our website and look at too. This is a bit dated. It actually goes to the infancy of our location-based services data in 2016. This is looking at one roadway location. So you can see a huge jump from 2016 to 2017, and then even a bigger jump from 2017 to 2018. And then we actually see a bigger jump to 2019. But that's not to say that the traffic on this roadway grew exponentially, right? But rather it's what you see on the right, that there's some cyclical nature of the course of the year, but the sample size is not correlated to the actual volumes on the roadways, right? So by using, permanent counters, data where we see 365 days of traffic a year, we can start to account for those differences and normalize our data so that we understand these seasonal changes and that you can actually measure, what is my MADT on a particular roadway. The next question we get is always accuracy. We've done a lot working with FHWA and other state DOTs to improve our ADT and other volume metrics. I think it's actually opened up a good can of worms of, what are the accuracies of using, temporary counts for ADT estimates versus, big data. Whereas, these are the ranges that we are getting right now in terms of our accuracy. So getting down to around 8% for high volume roads and 25% for low volume roads. But of course, those percentages are always relative to the volumes themselves. If you look at low volume roads, the actual absolute number is going to be smaller. We also, as Amanda said, we process the data for looking at bike and pedestrian counts. We have done, validation on that. We see high correlation for bike and pedestrian metrics, but it's still this other, approach of, well, we have certain amount of eco counters or permanent counters for bike and ped counts in our city, but how do we look at, everywhere else? So having a high correlation, using a different data source can fill in the gaps of understanding, bike and pedestrian movements when we don't maybe have the resources to count them locally. Then I'll just add, another validation looking at things like turning movements. This was from a white paper that looked like at Hennepin County in Minnesota, from Minnesota. And they saw close correlation with their turning movement counts analysis that they compared us to. all this is to say, there's really a lot of different use cases. I think big data is not just at the macro regional level anymore, but it's really at the also getting to the micro level, just from the increase in sample size over the past few years, and also going from cell phone tower data to location-based services data has really improved the spatial accuracy, which really gets us more on a roadway level. So with that, I will close and I believe open to questions.
Well, thank you, Amanda and Matt, for your presentations. I do see a few questions coming in. I'm going to assign those questions to both of you so you can see them, and if you want, you can type in answers. But I'm going to read the questions now. The first question, I believe it was for Amanda. The question says, how do you determine what data is coming from a bicyclist versus pedestrians versus slow-moving vehicles? That's a question. I think that was a question coming in during Amanda's presentation, but that could be answered by both of you.
Yeah, I think that's probably a Matt question. I know the gist behind it, but you probably have better detail than that, because from the user perspective, those modes are already separated out. I'm not doing that work.
Right. So in short, we use actual revealed GPS pings as training data. So this is either from revealed preference surveys from MPOs and states, where they actually get tagged pings of this is what a pedestrian trip looks like, this is what a bike trip looks like. Also from different apps that we know that people are bicyclists or a pedestrian. So using this data as training data, we assign attributes such as speed, acceleration, and as well as geographic attributes, where are their bike lanes, where is their, urban density, and then we apply it to the greater population of our location-based services data to assign all of our trips as, okay, how many of those are pedestrian trips or bicyclist trips? So there is, it is a, algorithm model to produce that. But again, where it fits in is like, there's no other way that we could maybe conduct bicycle and pedestrian counts at a citywide level without this type of approach. And you can check our website for our white paper on that methodology too.
Thanks, Matt. The second question is for Amanda. For the Vancouver data, were there any corrections made for travelers without a cell phone?
Yeah, so I've gotten this question before. Basically, what are the biases in this data if someone doesn't have a cell phone or the type of car that's being tracked for this data? The long and short of it is we use this data as just a part of the planning process. So we also used census data, we used ground truth count data, collected data, and then we also used the StreetLight data. So it's just a part of the process of informing us what's happening in the community. In addition to that, I would go back to what Matt was talking about, where when we're looking at the sample size, we're looking at so many more samples, something like 200,000 devices for the city of Vancouver that we're tracking, as opposed to taking, one count on one day and assuming it applies to the whole year. So I think just being mindful of that yes, there can be biases in the data, but when you use it as part of a larger planning process, that helps to overcome that shortcoming.
Thank you. And the next question is, how recent is the data available? I think that's a question to Matt.
Sure. So we like to call this more, data on demand. It's not real-time data. in a sense where we process the data about every 2 weeks. So we are either typically 2 to 4 weeks behind. But we do, again, log all of that data and give access so that people have up-to-date information. So it's somewhere in between, real time and then, more of the, travel surveys that are maybe collected every 4 years.
And I see you already typed your answers to the next question, but I would like you to verbally answer that one as well. Can StreetLight Data capture any surrogate safety data like near misses and conflicts?
So yeah, so no. So StreetLight doesn't collect non-GPS location information, right? So from the fleet management vehicles, we just get the GPS location lat longs. Although we have started partnering with Ford Safety Insights. So Ford obviously has their connected vehicle data, near misses, conflicts information, and we've overlaid our data so that you can see, what are the exposure metrics in terms of ADT and pedestrian volume compared to, crashes and near misses. But that's not data that we have ourselves.
The last question I see is, how does someone opt out of their data being collected?
So I guess, to start, so we don't have any apps or anything ourselves from the StreetLight. We use third-party vendors who work with 200 to 400 smartphone apps to collect the data, and these are not necessarily navigation-based apps. They could be weather apps, dating apps, apps to find the closest gas station. So within those apps, there's the typical, privacy user agreements that allow, those apps to be collecting your location data in the background. I will say, again, StreetLight keeps privacy at the forefront of everything we do. We don't collect any personally identifiable information. We only collect anonymized location records, lat long, timestamp ID that we wash every now and again.
Okay. There's another question coming in right now, and it's addressed to Matt. What other companies do you partner with to obtain data? Any car manufacturers who are already collecting data from connected vehicles?
Sure. So I already mentioned Ford. That on the safety side. Again, we're data agnostic in that we are currently in talks with a lot of different OEMs and connected car vehicle providers. I do believe that we have a new source of data, which is more focused on light duty commercial vehicles. It's not necessarily from a specific OEM, but from another data provider that's focused on providing the connected car vehicle GPS data.
Okay. Thank you, Matt. With that, I think we've answered all of the questions in the question box, and we are doing great on time. So we're going to enter into a break, a short break, and we'll come back at 2 p.m. to start our second session. When we are on the break, we'll stop recording of the webinar. Feel free to get moving, get some water, and we'll be back at 2 p.m. for the second session. And thank you very much, Amanda and Matt, for your presentations and answers. It's 2 p.m. now, so we're going to ask our speakers to turn on their camera. And we're gonna start our second session. I'll start recording from now. Before getting to our presentation, we are happy to have the two candidates for ITE Western District Secretary and Treasurer to speak to our attendees. With that, I'm gonna turn the floor to Doc Smith first. Doc?
Thank you, Maggie. Good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for taking the time to listen to what I have to say. I'm honored to be a nominee for Secretary Treasurer of the Western District, and I'm really happy to be here talking to the Oregon section today. I think it's an amazing ITE section, and we're lucky to have it in the district. I believe my experience and involvement in ITE over the last 30 years speaks for itself. I've been involved in the section, district, and international level. I'm not going to talk about that today. I think if you want to see my credentials, you can go to LinkedIn and Facebook, and you can take a look at all my detailed brochures. What I want to do is talk a little bit about my goals and why I'm doing this, why I'm running for office. Because it's a lot of work, and I respect everybody who does run for office for ITE. Over the last year, we've been challenged. We've been challenged in a lot of ways, and it's given us a lot of opportunity to change and evolve and think about why we do what we do. And I'm very happy to say that, you know, I appreciate being in the traffic engineering profession. I appreciate ITE, and I appreciated the fact that it's offered us a lot of flexibility over the last year to continue to do what we do. And it's because of that, because of my need to give back to ITE and give back to the profession, that I want to run for office. And so I have some goals for the next 4 years. And as you know, it's a 4-year commitment when you run for Secretary Treasurer of the district. I want to improve membership engagement. And I think the Oregon section has done a great job of leading the way in diversity and equity and putting together the webinars that the whole district has had access to. And I think we need to do more of that. We need programs like that to develop and increase engagement and involvement with all the section members within the Western District. I want to bring more innovation to the district. We've done a good job so far, but we need to continue to innovate, to improve and increase the virtual meetings and seminars available to our members, to provide expanded programs. We'll have to become more innovative, providing multimedia meetings and conferences so that people can attend in person and virtually. I think we need to continue to provide technical excellence. We need to provide technical content and technology sharing so that our members are the most capable in the industry and prepared for the challenges ahead. We also need to use that to attract and engage our young members, which I think is really important in this place. Connection and reaching out and engagement is so important with what we've gone through over the last year. And finally, I want to improve on our collaboration and mentoring. I think we need to provide leadership to collaborate as a district with all the sections to improve those programs and provide young IT members with mentoring. I think that mentoring is really important to show them, number one, the benefits of ITE, but also to help them work their way through the last year and see how they can develop their career against all kind of extreme odds. Finally, the electronic ballots come out in June. And I appreciate it if when you get those ballots, you consider voting for me. Hope you have a great day, have a great workshop, and hopefully we'll see you in person sometime very soon. Thank you.
Thank you, Doc. Our next candidate is Justin Link, and he would like to share his screen as well. So, Justin.
I apologize. Give me just a second. I have to enable the ability to. Apparently I have to quit the program. So we'll go ahead and skip that.
But we can hear you.
Perfect. So I appreciate very much the time and the opportunity to tell you a little bit about me. Professionally, I am the city traffic engineer for the city of Simi Valley. I have almost 20 years of experience in both the private and public sectors, including small firm, medium-sized regional firm, and large national firm experience, as well as mid-sized city where I currently work, a city of 120,000 people, and large city of Oxnard in Ventura County, over 200,000 people. I also served as an expert witness on traffic cases. So I bring with me a lot of different perspectives. As far as ITE is concerned, I have 17 years of continuously active volunteer experience with ITE. Since rechartering and serving as the first vice president for the Cal Poly SLO student chapter, I've been section president twice out in the Central Coast section, section administrator for the same, and since 2018. I was the Western District webmaster for 6 years, hotel chair for the Santa Barbara annual meeting, LAC, in 2012, and the co-chair for the Monterey annual meeting in 2019. So you can see that I like to volunteer. I like to give back to ITE because ITE has done very much for me. And I also have an inability to say no. The Monterey meeting, speaking of, was one of the most challenging and rewarding experiences I've ever had. And if you've had the pleasure of putting on one of those meetings, it's a fantastic experience. It's a challenging experience, but it's a very fulfilling experience. And I'm sorry to say that we won't be seeing everybody in Portland this year, but we'll be seeing everybody virtually, which is certainly excellent. And we'll be able to pivot and be able to continue reaching all of our different members. The Monterey meeting had 24 sponsors, 49 exhibitors, and 452 attendees, 93 of which were student registrants. So it's certainly an opportunity for the students every time we have them. Over the years, it has been a privilege to support those students who have come up in ITE and have since joined the workforce as full ITE members. As a volunteer for the District Career Guidance and Student Initiatives, I have helped review resumes, conduct speed interviews, and what could generously be called acting in workplace situation skits. And unfortunately, I've been pigeonholed into the bad cop, if you will. To that end, I'm also a sponsor level contributor to the Student Endowment Fund because I very much believe that the students need every opportunity they can get, and providing those opportunities keeps them in the fold, so to speak, keeps them in ITE so they can see the value. Speaking of value, if there's one thing I value about ITE, it's the feeling of community. And if there's one good thing that we can take from this pandemic is that we have found a way to virtually maintain our community despite not meeting in person. Today is a perfect example in this. And again, despite the fact that we can't be in Portland this summer, we have new options and new abilities to continue collaborating and sharing information. Where sections have been able to quickly pivot to a virtual format, we've seen greater attendance at meetings than ever before, and certainly that is the case in the Central Coast. My overarching goal, therefore, from the very beginning, is to leverage this virtual opportunity to create a larger community with deeper ownership through greater participation and transparency. By continuing our virtual reach at annual meetings, having virtual tracks and tours, we can provide a more economical and inclusive way of sharing ideas and information, especially for those who may not be able to afford the fees that are charged or the ability to attend or stay at the hotels. By supporting sections financially or otherwise to augment our in-person meetings with virtual, we can create additional opportunities to collaborate over large geographic areas and collaborate with other sections. We recently had what I've been calling the mega meeting. We were calling it the quad meeting with 4 sections, Central Coast, Riverside, San Bernardino, San Diego, and Southern California, and each section provided a different speaker. And this kind of collaboration can often help with the often difficult task of sourcing speakers. Finally, by broadcasting board meetings, we will know what's on the agenda, what's happening at the district level behind the scenes, and in real time. I believe these 3 initiatives can provide a more inclusive and transparent community to students and professionals alike and draw in new members along the way. Lastly, I have been fortunate and grateful to be recognized by my peers at the district level. I've received the Individual Achievement Award as well as the Young Professional Achievement Award for my contributions. And I've received endorsements from leaders, mentors, and colleagues throughout the way. I do truly believe in volunteering and giving back, and certainly this is an opportunity that I look forward to should I be elected. And I do this selflessly, though being recognized by your peers for your contributions is definitely an affirmation of your work for the community. Again, I thank you all for the opportunity. If you do get bored, you can go and check out my LinkedIn page. It's linkedin.com/JustinSLink, or you can check out my website, which is justinforite.com. Again, appreciate the opportunity, and everybody have a great day.
Thank you so much. For the ITE members of our attendees, I encourage you to check out their campaign website, and when the ballots come, go to your way, and please vote. With that, I'm gonna turn to Leah for presentation on urban logic. She's gonna present the benefit of a resilient system approach to mobility and transportation data collection and analysis in a COVID-19 world. This will be illustrated by a technical overview of the Urban Logic platform, highlighting real-world examples of how agencies such as the Texas DOT, the City of San Jose DOT, and the City and County of Honolulu use Urban Logic to better manage their data, regulate for insights, and become more resilient, nimble, and adaptable in an ever-changing environment. Leah is the head of, oh, I'm sorry, I forgot to share my screen. Leah is the head of business development at Urban Logic. She is a former advisor to the Federal Minister of Small Business and Tourism and Government House Leader. Leah was also a technical analyst in financial modeling for Deloitte, completed an exchange at the University of Zurich in banking and finance, and worked at the Vancouver Economic Commission performing economic research. Thank you for presenting at our workshop. And with that, I'm gonna turn the floor to Leah and make you the presenter.
Thank you. And to also introduce, I am joined by Julian Rafour, who is our principal data scientist at Urban Logic. I'll be doing the bulk of the presentation, but Julian is here to help answer any specific questions that people have. Maggie and Julian, can you see my screen okay? Can you hear me okay? Great. So today, in the light and in the spirit of this data analytics workshop, I thought I would take this time to really open up the curtain behind the world of data analytics, really see how the sausage is made, with the idea being, if we can provide you folks with more tools or better awareness of what the end outcome should be, it might help institute better practices internally, in addition to, making sure that your own data practices, data collection methods, and how you compute or use data to get to those insights, make that more resilient. Because this last year of the tumultuous year that we've had have kind of, exposed a couple of things. And, so we want to look at those things. And by the end of this presentation, you'll hopefully be able to take some of these very concrete lessons away, have more robust conversations with your IT departments, with economic development departments or other stakeholders along the journey of data and mobility data specifically. And, we want to make sure that this is applicable for everyone. So, consultants and, vendors and cities and regional governments and state governments alike, this should be relevant for everyone. And we're looking forward to getting all of your questions towards the end. About Urban Logic, very briefly, if you don't know us, we're based in Vancouver, British Columbia, the other Vancouver in this presentation, and we're exclusively a data integration and visualization analytics software platform that we have built specifically for government data and government use cases. We've been very humbled to work with now over 20 different agencies in Canada and the US. These are a couple of them. We'll focus on a couple of them, specifically Loudoun County, Virginia, Texas DOT, and the City and County of Honolulu, to give some specific examples of how these data practices, more resilient data practices, have actually translated into meaningful outcomes in real life, quote unquote. But to preface all of this, again, I want to kind of dig a little bit deeper and also kind of magnify or translate some of these things in the data engineering world that might kind of enlighten us a little bit and give us better tool set and mental framework to be able to approach data analytics in our day-to-day. So to kind of contextualize this whole conversation, you know, a lot of these conversations, especially when you talk to other software platforms, you know, data providers like StreetLight, who we just heard from, INRIX, who we'll be hearing from a bit later, at least a case study on them, and the world is really becoming just hugely populous of all of these data providers, data platforms who are promising and selling insights, because we know what ITE members in particular can do with these insights. We are continuously humbled in our work with our government clients, as well as the consultants that also work with them in this whole ecosystem of better mobility, and, you know, always striving to fix problems and to, you know, move the marker on really big, hairy problems like mobility equity, like fewer greenhouse gas emissions, safer roads, all of these things. We are continuously humbled by what you folks can do when you do have insights that at your disposal. And so I think when we're going to be talking about this, it's really all around, you know, how can we get to the insight? You know, I'm not going to sell you on the insight. I'm not going to talk about, you know, you guys know what to do when you have the insight. Let's, you know, today, let's talk about the journeys to getting to those insights so that you trust them, you have confidence in them, they respect the privacy of individuals, they are highly secure, and they're also able to be shared and be, you know, less painful to create, especially when you're looking at, you know, a smaller to medium to smaller agency or consulting shop that doesn't have the data science, the data engineering power that, you know, some of the larger ones might have. So, as I mentioned, there are literally dozens of different pathways to get to insights. Again, we just heard from StreetLight on one. There are, you know, and all of these insights can create better outcomes for people. So, you know, how you get there, let's just say you have options. In the traffic and transportation space, typically it's been a one-way road, you know, through proper data collection, you can create insights, very, you know, follow the yellow brick road as far as data collection goes. Now, in the rise of COVID has exacerbated a lot of these problems, or a lot of pre-existing problems that, you know, in our previous life of in-person work, of being able to effectively do field operations, et cetera, it kind of masked some of these things that we're starting to realize. First and foremost, manual traffic data collection, which by and large is still very much relied upon by a number of different agencies, was very rattled by the COVID-19 lockdowns, and in many places it still hasn't effectively recovered yet. COVID-19 has also exposed a lot of not remote work friendly data storage and data handling practices. If you're like me, you've sent a whole lot of emails these last 365 days, as well as working a lot more in Excel, a lot more in PDF. And this is a tax, unfortunately, that's held on to a lot of people who are looking to use, wrangle, and manage data insights on a day-to-day basis. And then another one, these are just the three that I came up with kind of on the spot. You could probably list, there are dozens of more exacerbated pre-existing conditions, but specifically when it comes to data management, I think these are probably the three big ones. And then the final one here is determining the veracity of metrics calculated through manual processes. So what I mean by this is really just when you are over-reliant on manual data collection and manual processes where you're extracting data and using it, you know, putting it into things like Synchro or putting it into other modeling, Excel-based models or otherwise, and you're working with a decentralized team, with very imperfect communication tools. As much as, you know, working from home might be very good, Zoom and Teams and GoToMeeting isn't exactly comparable to being able to just walk down the hall and talk to one of your colleagues. So all of these things have kind of, again, created those taxes on data collection and data processes that were probably very brittle and very rigid to begin with. And all of this is, of course, underpinned by an increased commitment to things like cybersecurity, data privacy, the push to modernize. You know, I think there was a cartoon right before COVID, or right as COVID was getting going, where COVID was like a big wrecking ball, and it was, you know, going to knock out a boardroom, saying that, oh, we can just modernize later. So this big push to modernize, and we've all had to really take this on our backs and run with it, just as a, like, because COVID was our forcing function. We're of course always hoping to be more transparent and open. And then finally, this is something that, you know, we've talked about at length even before COVID, was this move of budgets from capital cost-based to operations cost-based. A lot of people with recurring subscription costs sometimes, especially in this very budget constrained environment, don't know where their next budget or dollars are going to be coming from. So it's hard to be able to effectively plan, and this onus on operational expenditures is kind of just really becoming a little bit tenuous. So, and also just kind of going back to traffic data collection is, let's be honest, it's not really a perfect straight, you know, glowing line, really, is it? There's data cleaning involved. Sometimes there's duplicates, sometimes there's errors, sometimes it's limited and you have to go back and collect more. And so the straight line is actually kind of looks like this. So now I bring you to data engineering basics, or data engineering 101, where I'll kind of, you know, the tent of data collection methods, as I mentioned at the beginning, is just only increasing and increasing. And we still have a lot of those manual counts just kind of sitting around, or they were used for their specific purpose and then kind of shelved to TBD. Plus there's all of these additional amazing methods of collecting data, but all of them still are driving towards the promised land of insights. So if we kind of look under the hood of what it takes to get from data to insight, because the two are not the same. The two are definitely not the same. You need to go through a lot of processes to make data into something that is useful. So this is why Julian is here with me, because he can actually talk a little bit about in our question and answers and dig into how we do this if you're interested. But I think at the very least, if you are a consumer of insights, of mobility insights, these are the things that you have to be aware of about, you know, how you got your insight, how you got to your insight. Schemas, data schemas, this is typically how your data looks. So your data typically comes in like a tabular format, but schemas are more subtle than you think they are. They're even down to the name of the column, how the name of the column is spelled, the use of underscores versus dashes, you know, all of these things. And having that in unison is a very humongous undertaking in some cases, depending on where you are on the sophistication level of data management practices. Then you have a thing called extraction, transformation, and loading, or extraction, loading, and transformation. This is the process of taking all of your data sets and making and extracting the information to help make them look the same, so that you can actually start to compare apples to apples and get your data to start talking to each other. The validation and normalization. This is some of the things that StreetLight was just talking about, where they actually validate some of their location-based data with ADT counts from permanent sensors in the ground, or various count locations in various areas. And so this is a very important step, typically, even when you're just dealing with one data source, to make it more reliable, have higher confidence intervals, you need to have this extra step in order to achieve those things. Outlier detection and anomaly detection is very important. Quality checks, of course. Geocoding. Now, this is a very interesting one, just because geocoding, not all data is geocoded in the same definition as what we use geocoding. Sometimes we'll have there are various counts that say that at the corner of Main and First, or sometimes you see in crash data that'll be several hundred feet before an intersection, those sorts of things. When we talk about geocoding, we talk about translating those descriptors of location into a physical longitude and latitudinal point that you can sit on a map. And, you know, Urban Logic, we see that we deal with so much tabular data, and tabular data analysis can be exceptionally powerful. And, you know, in the world of traffic and transportation and mobility, spatial context matters so much. And so the more we can get data all talking to each other on the same map, the more effective our decision making can be, and the additional integrations with other spatial layers can be made. So geocoding is something that is always talked about almost synonymously with traffic data collection. And so again, expanding the tent from, you know, just manual counts, all of this is kind of, again, builds upon itself when you're thinking about all of now the hundreds of different ways that you can select or you can collect traffic and transportation data. We've kind of grouped them into 3 big buckets, and I can talk about those buckets in a little bit more granularity here. So unstructured manual count data is what I talked about a lot. Typically, they don't have uniform data schemas, so they all are very different. They all tend to be, you know, unique to their own count time and period that they did. That changes by vendor, depends on, you know, which kind of person is actually counting that day. If they decide to spell street, S-T-R-E-E-T, or ST period. They're not interoperable. They're very fixed in a Excel spreadsheet. They're typically not geospatial. Typically, there's typically no longitude and latitude provided in these counts. Prone to human error, not in the data, but I mean, you know, sometimes they misspell the street, or sometimes they get the street wrong, or, you know, all of these different things that are packaged within this piece of data that can be a bit erroneous. The great thing about them, though, is that they're highly, highly, highly accurate. They do capture 100% of your road users during their count period. Then, of course, we have structured sensors. Sensors are great because they give you data in very predictable formats all the time. Sometimes, depending, like when I mean interoperable, I basically mean, you know, they can plug into other systems, which sometimes is not the case because sometimes the sensor doesn't have an API or something like that. And so that means they're kind of stuck within exporting a CSV or an Excel sheet all the time. Sometimes they're geospatial. One downside of sensors, of course, is that they can malfunction. Accuracy can be questionable. And then systems and applications data, that is, you know, the streetlights, the, you know, INRIXs, the location-based data services, connected vehicles. The one thing I will say, generally, you know, we work with a lot of different vendors on this. Overall, we think it's going to really revolutionize long-term how traffic and transportation decisions are made as we build up confidence in these data sets. However, they're really big. I know that StreetLight does a lot of extra effort in processing, as you know, they were just explaining, you know, to make sure that the final product is something that you can just kind of pick up and use. But you can also go directly to things like connected vehicle partners and buy direct from them. But these data sets are humongous, and so you have to kind of be a little bit conscious of what resources you have on hand in order to handle that volume of data. This is how Urban Logic does it. And then after this, we'll kind of get into the examples of where this theory and where this kind of process-based example actually equated into realized traffic and transportation outcomes in a real-life setting. But Urban Logic is, you know, again, we also do this at scale. This is what we do for a living. Julian Rafour actually worked exclusively on City and County of Honolulu, which had over a decade of historical traffic counts in various different formats. And we have worked together to make sure that it can actually be ingested into a geospatial single pane application, so it's easier for people to work with. But we do that across all those 3 major buckets of data types within this space. So we do unstructured data sources, that is your manual accounts, your structured databases, which are your sensors, and then your systems and applications data. We also work with those. And this goes through a very intensive data engineering and data normalization to make sure that you have the good quality of the penetration rate that you want. And all of that is kind of basically that creates a massive data lake. And on top of that, you can actually start to build really important analytics because all of your data is finally interoperable, is talking to each other. It's apples to apples comparative, and you can actually use all the data sets to start to validate each other as well. So the robustness of the insights that you're using on top of this become far greater over time. And on top of that, you can get into really crazy things like machine learning, artificial intelligence, and I'll show you an example of when you can really push the boat out and start to really leverage the power of all of this data in one place. But really, I think what Urban Logic is very much focused on is making this data usable, making these packaged insights accessible to people, no matter what your background is, and being able to actually take it and run with it, or being able to contribute back into an ecosystem of different different tools and different software services that you might already have access to, or even hardware services that you might even have access to. And that's through things like APIs, or basically little bits of code that automatically pull data and put it into something else. And this is typically what the data flows are. This is important because, not only with better, more like higher integrity data insights at the end, with better data management, but better data cleaning, and kind of that commitment on the front end, the extensibility of your data sets just exponentially grows. There are so many different stakeholders in mobility data across the economics, land use planning, all of these different things. And so with the better care and more resilient data systems, we can actually make and increase the use of this data across any number of different use cases and achieve so many different outcomes for people across the span of different services across the city, across a region, across a state, etc. So how does this work in real life? So what we did for the Texas Department of Transportation is we kind of put this whole theory on steroids. So Texas has at least, there were 3 statewide databases that we ingested from TxDOT. Their crash database, their Lone Star, and their STARS volume database as well. Also a ton of open data that they've really invested in, various freight transportation studies, truck parking spots, a lot of this, both manual and automated data collection efforts, that was just in the state itself. Never mind the overriding priority to want to start to leverage some of this really exciting location data to get even more further ahead of the curve when making transportation decisions. And so all of this work in taking these humongous databases is we actually started to, we really focused deeply on making them co-validated and interoperable as well. So one of the limitations on the volume collection for TxDOT is that, I remember talking to one of the folks we were working with over there, and he was saying, if we asked every district how they counted traffic volume, we'd get 25 different answers. So one of the things that we did is we added validation components on top of this. So we actually had a confidence of statewide volume that we knew was comparative and apples to apples on top of everything. Plus that was additionally co-validated again with things like the connected vehicle data that we started to incorporate. And the end result of all of this was that TxDOT virtually has now an app store where they can develop use cases on top of this single pane of transportation data that they're confident in, and that they can kind of continue to develop outcomes-based use cases on top of. So at the currently right now, we have 5 different use cases around wrong-way driving, which is topical, I guess, traffic impact analysis, freight, before and after COVID emergencies, and even pass-through origin destination analysis. So looking at one in particular, because I wanted to show kind of where really you can start to go when it comes to data analysis, moving that from data analysis into data prediction, is working with TxDOT, Julian developed a traffic impact prediction model, which takes realized and observed origin destination pairs and redistributes them across a road network using universal road segments, OSM&X specifically, to show what would happen to traffic if there was in the presence of a large event, which this was all designed or scoped out before COVID, where large events were still a reality. But we were specifically looking at South by Southwest in Austin, as well as Longhorns football games and similar events that would drive a lot of traffic to downtown Austin. And so to help the TxDOT, as well as their stakeholders, better manage traffic in and around these events. And not only, we didn't stop at events, we also looked at, what if you were to do road closures? What if you were to reduce the capacity on various roads? How would that change, validated connected vehicle trips, given the fact that we had access to all of this very robust ADT data and traffic count data from the state, given all of the rest of that. And so this is still a bit of a POC, but we're going to be developing this more and also kind of tying it to safety outcomes as well. Based on traffic impact and expected increases in volumes and different things, how does that relate to the safety indicators of these roads and of these intersections as well? Another example, I mentioned earlier that Julian is working hard on the Honolulu data, where we started small with Honolulu, where it was just one traffic department, transportation services, just had so much traffic count data sitting around not doing anything. And all they wanted was a single repository of all this information together, just so that they could more easily respond to customer requests, that they could perform studies a lot more easily, share insights with other people. But this theory kind of ballooned to naturally extend the ask to things like Oahu Transit Authority, Hawaii State DOT, as well as the police department, because everyone, again, wanted value in this very robust traffic data. And we're still in the process of improving day-to-day data maintenance within the city and county. However, what this has started is kind of a really meaningful conversation where now Urban Logic is actually helping the city and county of Honolulu develop traffic impact standards so that every traffic impact that they get in is actually now standardized and is able to be ingested into a platform. So it's easy to use and easy to access. And then final example is the city and county of, Loudoun County in Virginia, where they're finally onboarding. It's a very interesting situation because counties in North Virginia don't actually manage their roads. VDOT manages all of that. But what was interesting about Loudoun County is that they wanted to actually develop a very robust traffic count program in-house and develop analytics and information on top of that, specifically because there's a lot of development going on. They wanted to kind of own a piece of that themselves. So they had various sensors, 3 different types of radar and speed sensors. They perform their own consultant counts too. And so what was very interesting about Loudoun is that we had all of these different data sources that we could point to a single geometry. A geometry being a specific line or a specific road segment or a specific intersection in space and time. Basically, this means that not only is there kind of a unified golden record of data within the city and within the county of Loudoun, but it's just so much easier for people to interact with and to contribute onto, so that we develop these standards and far more robust, far more resilient practices on an ongoing basis. So in conclusion, I would say that, insights can be made so much more trustworthy, accurate, secure, easier to access, and easier to share through this systems approach to data collection and data management. And with better insights, we can achieve such far better outcomes. And the most important thing is always a big question, do you need a fancy big data platform, hire a data engineer, or do all this stuff to get you started? Absolutely not. A couple of lessons about what you can do to even just make your own lives easier as you start to look at your data sets, whether you use services like StreetLight or other ones, or whether you kind of still do a lot of that data analysis in-house and, consultants talking to you as well, of course. I think there's a lot of ground that can be made up when we're going straight to the market to ask for these things, ask for data collection of the market, asking for things like consistent attributes, naming conventions. OpenStreetMaps is a universal standard that can be your friend. So you can work with to at least make sure that all of your segments are uniform. We see road segments change all the time, or road links, whichever your verbiage. And this kind of just creates a lot of headaches over time and a lot of miscommunication. You can ask for longitude and latitude points, so you don't have any miscommunication of where the count locations are or where the counts specifically were. And you can adopt a universal schema. We actually have examples of one on our website, which you should definitely go and check out. I will say, certainly consider big data. So many products and resources are out there that can be really, really helpful. If you go straight to get the raw stuff, it's huge. We're talking, billions and billions of data points, as our friend from StreetLight was saying earlier. And also, the evolution of data privacy and, these sorts of restrictions, well, not the restrictions, regulations, I should say, are constantly evolving, right? And I think it's just something to be aware of and, pay attention to as we build more of our infrastructure around metrics that rely on these sources of information. And also, as always, start from the use case and work backwards. Different use cases have different accuracy tolerances depending from different data sets. And so depending on what you're looking for, that will obviously depend on what data source is most appropriate. Consider secure cloud storage for your data, just so that it's easier to access and it's more resilient to things like, like business continuity or being able to access it when you're suddenly all told to work remotely. We're on Azure. There are so many different things out there. We are not salespeople for anyone other than Urban Logic, so we're not advocating for one or the other. If you have any questions, we're happy to walk you through them. Definitely advocate for sensor quality checks and ask if your vendors are secure. Big investments in things like certifications like your ISO 2700 series and your NIST 800 series. These are things that I think aren't talked enough about at ITE. And so I think, and we're very passionate about this because I came from government, as my bio said, and I've seen firsthand where cybersecurity issues unfold, especially in the government of Canada. So always happy to answer more questions on this one. Also, finally, it just takes time. It takes time to develop these practices. It takes time to clean data. Just ask Julian and why he has more gray hair in the last 3 years than he did before. And it's a patient, but it's well worth the investment. I cannot emphasize that enough. If you want any more information, we have a big ebook on our website that you can go to, where you can easily access this ebook that goes over all different types of data sources, not just modern, but traditional as well. And then we also have a lot of resources on just, accuracy, as well as how to improve, tips to improve your traffic data collection with templates. That's all downloadable for free on our website. So would highly encourage you, or just drop me an email. But that's all I have for my presentation. We can do questions now, I think. Maggie?
Yes, thank you for the great presentation, Leah. So I, just got a question in, actually. This question is, can you tell us more about the vendor certificates? What benefits do they give public agencies?
Yeah, no, it's a great question. The certificates basically govern the internal security practices of an agency or of an entity. Agencies can actually go up for their ISO 2700 series as well. I believe the city of San Jose has just done that. And basically, that dictates to us, how do we deal with personally identifiable information? What are our protocols if a security breach happens? What are the methods of us contacting the people who are impacted by these things? And so I would say the number one benefit that public agencies will receive from knowing that their vendors are ISO certified is that they have to be audited frequently by a third party, by a registered certified third party that you can also audit, and that these are international certifications that are up to the same standards of very similar public agencies, like San Jose is a good example, as well as others. And so it's more about actually having open and transparent commitment from your vendors that they do comply with very stringent security requirements, so that you know that your data is protected, so that you know that your data is compliant with privacy restrictions and regulations, and that they're audited frequently. So I hope that answers the question.
Thank you. I don't see more questions coming in, so this is a reminder to our attendees that you can either type in questions in the questions box, or you could raise your hand and we could turn on the audio functions for you. So Leah, I have another question. That a lot of the things that you introduced apply to public agencies. I don't have experience working at a public agency. I've always been on the consulting side, and some of the things that you mentioned really like we have similar struggles with. For example, is the data format, data schemas that we went through similar process a few years ago, asking the common data vendors that we usually work with to provide data in a certain format that we want, but still we get data in slightly different format, and then we have to adapt our tools on our end to work with each of their data format. Do you have any suggestions for like companies as us that work with different vendors?
I will pass that one over to Julian, who is in this data every day, all day. And so I'll hand it over to him for a comment on that.
Thanks, Leah. Yeah, it's a really difficult problem to handle. And if you're not careful with it, something that we had to learn early on was you need to be there's a mix of being clever and setting up good processes that maybe can handle something like this versus being a little bit, too clever where in the end you actually do something wrong. I think one of the cities we worked with initially had something like 20 different vendors, all delivering data in various formats. And one of the bits of work that we had to do was to actually unify all this data together. And the first crack we took at it was at Urban Logic. We use Python, and we figured we could write some very clever code that would handle all of this. And what we found actually was, yeah, it worked, but we spent all the time we saved on the code, we used later on to check if it was actually right, which was this really unfortunate side effect of writing this. So as far as advice goes, or maybe approaches go, is sort of for different kinds of formats, you can sort of play the 80-20 rule. So you can try to develop processes that handle, most of the cases. But you do need to be careful about any process that handles all the cases sort of blanket, because in the end, you don't want to extract data or unify this data and have it being wrong in the end, because you actually need to use it, right? The goal isn't to extract it, it's to use it in some kind of analysis. And if it's wrong at the end, well, this was all moot. It doesn't matter. Your cleverness or your process was actually not worth the time. So what we ended up using on our end is a mix. We write and follow processes that try to handle the majority of the cases that we can determine. And then we're very careful with the cases that fail. So if for whatever reason a particular format doesn't fit it, we try and make it very easy to detect those cases and to be able to handle them specifically. Because otherwise you think you're saving time with your very clever processes and very clever code, say if that's what you happen to use, and in the end you find yourself coming back having to debug or quality control everything personally, which is sort of what you wanted to avoid. So it's a balance.
Yeah, I agree. And thank you for the answer.
My pleasure.
Yes, thank you. I don't see any other questions coming in, so we'll go ahead and we'll go to break. We'll meet back here at 3 o'clock for our next session. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks.
Thank you.
turn to Ioana.
Welcome back to the Data Analytics Workshop. Our last stop on this journey is a look at the RIDIS and INRIX data. Now, please join me in welcoming our ODOT speakers. Sean Strasser is a traffic signal operations engineer with ODOT headquarters traffic section. He specializes in traffic signal data analytics and reporting. Chi Mai is a transportation system analysis engineer with Oregon Transportation Planning Analysis Unit, short TPAO. She has extensive experience in transportation system analysis, traffic modeling, and data analytics. And our third speaker is Carrie Franny. She is a transportation planner in Region 1 for the Majors Projects team. In the past 2 years with ODOT, she has been instrumental in the launching of the Bus on Shoulder pilot program in Portland and assists with projects such as the Region 1 traffic performance reports and COVID-19 traffic impact reports. To get this started, I would like to hand it over to Sean Strasser. Take it away.
Thanks, Ioana. Okay, so here we go. I'm going to try to share the right screen. This one, I want this one. Okay, so do you see my browser? Just a blank browser?
Yeah, we see a dark Google site.
All right, thank you. So I'm going to introduce RIDIS and kind of go over some things very briefly. The first thing that I wanted to show, so this is the RIDIS platform, and this is kind of in line with what we've seen earlier with the probe data, where you're getting data from GPS. I don't want to say spying on people because they do it sort of willingly, but maybe unknowingly. At any rate, we get the RIDIS is a platform that brings in data from lots of these different sources and provides out-of-the-box analytical tools to be able to perform analysis and real-time monitoring. So this is a tool that's available to, let me show you how you can get access really quick. We're going to have a link in the slide, but we can just, if you just do a search for ODOT RIDIS, it's the first page that'll pop up. So we have a really great website hosted by ODOT, gives an overview of what it is and who can have access. So this is for any public agency in the state of Oregon, free of charge, or any consultant or university staff performing work for a public agency in Oregon. And that covers, I think, the majority of attendees here. So if you don't have an account, get an account, start using it. If you have an account but you haven't gotten into it yet, I would like to just say that this is an extremely valuable tool, but it's also extremely underutilized, I think. Part of that is just because you're looking at this this suite of tools, and it's frankly a little overwhelming. There's a lot to choose from. You don't really know what they do. So I'm going to demo a couple of them. So I'm going to jump right in. I do want to add, though, that if you go back to that ODOT website, you can go down here. We've got a ton of training sessions for ODOT staff that were recorded and made available to everybody. There's also tutorials here. There's help. So there's a ton of resources, but it is a little bit of a learning curve to get started. It's not, I mean, it's not super complicated. It's just get the toe in the water and then away you go. So here's the Region Explorer. This is a useful tool for monitoring, for looking at live traffic. It's similar to Google Maps, the traffic view that you get, except that with this one, you can, these blue dots are actually bottlenecks. The blue lines are how far back the bottleneck extends. And you can come in here and you can double click on an intersection and it's going to load
data for you showing the past 6 hours of what happened today and compare that to the average historical speeds. It does take a little bit to load, so I'm trying to talk slow. Okay, here we go. So what we can see here, the blue line is the past 6 hours, and then the gray line is the historical average. So these are pretty similar. I don't think there's anything unusual happening here. If there was, you would see a big divergence between the two. So that's one really useful tool. I want to show another useful tool, and this is also going to focus on live monitoring of traffic. And I know a lot of us probably don't do live monitoring of traffic. I don't really, but for those who might, this will be super useful. It's a dashboard. So I created this dashboard during the wildfires when we're looking at potential evacuations of these major urban areas. So these are likely evacuation routes. And what we're able to do with that is to take a quick glance at the dashboard and see, are any of these routes performing very poorly? So what you have is the current speed and the historic speed, and you see the differential. So most of these, it looks like we're pretty close to the historic, so there's nothing unusual except maybe this one. It looks like we're a little bit slower, so maybe there's an incident. If there is an accident or some type of incident, you would see that reflected here very quickly. So this would be an excellent way to be notified of something happening and respond accordingly. Now, I'm a traffic signal operations engineer. I don't respond to these live incidents really. I'm more involved in analyzing historical data. So for example, we make a signal timing change and we want to see, okay, what did that do? Did we make an improvement? There's a lot of really great tools here, and one of the ones that I like to use a lot because it's pretty simple and straightforward to understand is performance charts. So I'll do a quick demo of a performance chart. Now, all of the tools that you have available, other than the ones I just showed you where you're looking at live monitoring as opposed to historical analysis, you get this over here. You can select your segments, you choose your date range, you choose your data source, your granularity. I actually have I'm not going to go into this because this is something that you can, some of you are familiar with, and if you're not, this will be covered in the tutorial, and there's not really enough time to get into the details of how to do this. But I do have a saved segment in here that I would pull up. So you could just pick any segment. Here's Mission Street. So previously I went in and created this and then I saved it. So it's always there. Something I want to point out is the data sources. So first, we've got XD segments and TMC segments. The TMC segments are longer, they're more aggregated. So the dashboard that I showed you, I believe that's using TMC segments. For these really long routes, you don't need little segments to see high detail. You just want to see the whole route at once, and having those bigger segments that the calculations are faster. But for me, what I do is working with traffic signals. So I want to see as much granularity as I can. So I only use the XD segments, and the XD segments are only available from INRIX. So if we cleared this out, then other sources will show up down here. So INRIX here, TomTom are the big ones, and but I mostly just use INRIX. So after you set up your parameters here, you can click submit. I'm not going to do this here because it actually does take a few minutes to generate the report. I actually already did this beforehand. And so this is for Mission Street. It's a before and after comparison of 2 time periods. I'm going to clean this up a little bit. Get rid of those percentiles, just show the averages. The date range that we're looking at for the first one is February 13th through the 19th, and then the next one is the week after that. I chose these dates for a specific region, or specific reason, and that is because we had an ice storm that knocked out power. So if you want to see how travel speed was impacted during that time, it took actually it took a few days, I think, maybe a week to get power back to all the traffic signals on Mission Street. So they were dark or in flash a lot of time and sometimes being operated on backup power. So we can see that there's a big difference in speed. So again, we've got speed on the y-axis and time of day on the x-axis here. There's a lot of different options to select for this graph. We're looking at speed. I prefer not to use speed. I prefer to use, so there's buffer index, travel time index, planning index. I prefer these indexes. So we could look at travel time in minutes, but if you have a longer corridor versus a shorter corridor, it doesn't really make sense to compare total travel time. So instead you can look at the travel time index, which normalizes these numbers. So you could do a more apples to apples comparison. And I think others might use congestion. I mean, there's a lot of different options here. They have different definitions and they're calculated in different ways. So once you get into that, that's one of the things that you can go into the help to see how those are calculated, what they mean. Okay, so the last thing I wanted to show you is, so for the vast majority of standard users, these tools are going to be more than enough than what you need. It's just taking the investing the time to become familiar with them, to start using them. For some of you though, you're going to want to download the raw data and work with it on your own. There's some reasons why you might want to do that. So there's this option, the Massive Data Downloader. This is a really neat tool. You can, it's good to use for a single study that you're doing. It's the same interface for selecting the data. You can even access your saved segments and then download the data that you want. However, if you want to do something programmatically or in an automated fashion, you would, instead of using this, you might use the API. So Redis has an API. INRIX also has an API. If you don't know what the API is, it's just a way for 2 applications on the web to talk to each other. So I wrote a Python code. It's available in GitHub. I can share that if anybody wants. So what this does is it calls the INRIX API, and then it downloads the data automatically to a folder that you specify. So what I do with that is I've got a folder here, daily download, and so each morning at 4 a.m. it just downloads the data from the previous day to this folder, and then that can be ingested into your visualization tools like Tableau or Power BI. So that's what I'm doing with that. I wanted to show a couple of use cases for things that you might want to do with the data. So one of them would be combining travel time or speed data with traffic volumes. So this is an example from City of Sandy. and Sandy is between Portland and Mount Hood. So there's a lot of recreational traffic from Sandy to Mount Hood, from Portland to Mount Hood. So you see a lot of seasonal variation. We're looking at the weekends, and you can see as the orange is the volume, and then the yellow is the speed. Right? They're inversely related. As the volumes go up, speed goes down, but not necessarily. If we look at eastbound traffic, and this is heading towards the mountain on the weekend, you get big spikes in the morning, early morning here in January, February, tapers off in March, gone in April, starts to pick up in December. And so snowboarders, skiers, and whoever wants to head up to the mountains is heading out early in the morning. But at the same time, you don't actually see a big drop in travel time here, or in speed, sorry. So maybe you don't need to be too worried about creating your custom plan at 7:30 in the morning. Maybe it's okay, I don't know. That's one insight that you could get. I want to show one other use case for this data. So this is travel time on the x-axis in minutes for the Lincoln City corridor. So that would be traveling from one end of the corridor to the other and back in minutes. And on the y-axis, we've got average volume per lane in a 15-minute period. So each of these dots is a specific 15-minute time period. And if you hover over it, you'll see the exact date and time for that time period. So this is from September 9th in Lincoln City. That was actually the day that the entire city was evacuated due to the wildfires. And so this is really interesting though, because you see this relationship between volume and travel time, and then it's increasing until it caps out at max capacity. And you can kind of see here, if we bring October on top of September, you can see that over time, this relationship seems to be pretty enduring. And if that relationship changes suddenly, maybe that could be good or bad. It could change due to a signal timing change or an incident, something like that. So this is a use case, possible use case for bringing that raw data and joining it to other data. Ultimately, what I'd really like to do with this travel time data is tie it to detection failures on traffic signals. So when you have a detector fail, if you can correlate that to an increase in travel time, then you know that you want to prioritize fixing that detector. I think that's most. I guess I'll show maybe one other quick thing here. Oh, sorry, I'm gonna bring another screen over. Okay, so one other interesting thing, I think, interesting idea was, and this is specific to traffic signals. So this is a map of all of the XD segments for Oregon. And this is a Python Jupyter notebook. And so you can bring in those segments, and then I'm going to overlay traffic signals on top of that and create a buffer around them, and then use a spatial join. And then we get a list of these segments. So I've got an attribute table here with a bunch of segments, and join those to the unique identifier for the traffic signal. Now I can use that list to pull only the data that I want to see and create relationships between those two. So that's another potential use case, and then use that in the custom reporting to tie up those detector problems, to correlate those to increases in travel time, et cetera. So that's it. I want to end just by saying, get rid of this. I want to end just by saying that this Redis platform is super useful. You should definitely be using it. You don't need to get into this other stuff with like APIs and coding and like If you want to, that's awesome. But these tools really are sufficient for most users, I think, and they are definitely worth spending the time to get to know. So thank you, and I'll pass the time on. I just realized I forgot to share the first slide of our presentation, but I guess I'll leave that to, okay, I'll stop sharing now.
Can you see my screen now? Okay, yep. Okay, so hello everyone, good afternoon. My name's Chi Mai. Oops, sorry. So Carrie and I will present on the 2020 traffic performance report. We consider this as a use case for the RIDIS and the INRIX data. And so I will, like Carrie, start with the first half of the presentation, and then I will follow on the second half.
Great, thanks, Chi. So Region 1 Major Projects has been producing a traffic performance report every 2 or 3 years for the last 4 years, first out in 2016, then one in 2018, and we're currently wrapping up the 2020 report. The purpose of this report is to monitor the performance of Region 1's freeway system, and this helps us choose different projects that we would like to support or prioritize in the region by looking at a variety of performance indicators, including congestion, reliability, and safety. And here is an overview of one of our region-wide performance metrics and pages that we include in our performance reports. So this is in regards to bottlenecks is there kind of on the left-hand side, and then buffer time is there on the right. Without getting too in-depth into the data itself, as I'm sure on your screen, this picture looks pretty small. But in terms of speeds, we're on average seeing, the highest or the lowest speed in the PM peak hour on all of our corridors. We're seeing bottlenecks across the region, and we're seeing relatively high buffer times as well on most of our corridors. In some instances, more in the midday than the AM, but for the most part, the highest buffer time is also in the PM. And our region-wide indicators also include a variety of other measures, once again, including safety, non-crash incidents, general travel time, and reliability as well. Next slide, please. And here is a slightly more in-depth look at the bottlenecks. We're going to kind of get into later on in our presentation how we determined where bottlenecks were using the RIDIS platform. But here's a quick overview. These are the worst bottlenecks in the region. And as you can see from some of this data, they are occurring sometimes over 12 hours during the day. And the way that we choose to show this data is to include the location of the bottleneck, the queue length, which is right there, kind of right below or next to the bottleneck location, and then the duration and the time of day that we're seeing it. So orange is generally indicating time in the AM hours, and purple is indicating time in the PM hours. Like I said, you can kind of see on that second one for I-5 southbound, it's just occurring all the time. The whole clock is taken up by a bottleneck. Next slide, please. We also go into detail on a corridor level, along with a region-wide level. So this is a sample page from our I-5 corridor section. Each corridor section is about 8 or 10 pages and includes an introduction about the corridor, recent improvements that have occurred along the corridor, and upcoming improvements to kind of highlight different work that ODOT is doing in order to help relieve congestion. It also includes details about bottlenecks, the reliability, safety, travel time, and speed. So some of those dashboards that you saw on the previous screens are included at the corridor level as well as the regional level. Next slide, please. And finally, the 6 corridors that we have highlighted are I-5, I-84, I-205, I-405, US 26, and Oregon 217. At this time, we're not including any arterial roads. That just isn't part of our scope yet. But we do look at these, which are once again the 6 major freeways in the Portland area.
Thank you, Carrie. So as far as data that's in our 2020 traffic performance report, we have the probe data that we have from RITIS. And so we have chosen among the different sources, we chose INRIX XD data for speed. As for volume, we get our volume from automatic traffic recorders. And for Oregon 217, we get it from the sensors at our ramp meter locations and various radar locations, and that's in Portal. And then we also have the reported crashes that's in our crash system. And then another source that we look at is incident data. But for the for this report, for this presentation, we're gonna focus on what's in RITIS, and the 3 data sources that are for probe data that you can retrieve are INRIX data, HERE data, and TomTom data. TomTom is a bit old, and we don't have much of it. I think we only have a year's worth of data from 2010 when we purchased our vZoom network for modeling. But we do have that incorporated into RITIS. And but for this analysis for our performance report, we mainly focus on the INRIX XD data. And so the steps that we went through was we first created a list of the INRIX XD segments. So we identify each of our freeway corridors. We identify the XD segments that we want. And we kind of do that by mapping the segment to the corridors. And that way it allows us to analyze the data. And just to kind of give you, we have an ODOT team, and then we also hire DKS as our consultant to help us with some of the data processing. And then we download the data from RITIS, which is from what Sean had just demonstrated with the data download. And through that process, we also filter out the weekdays, and then we excluded the holidays. We wanted to basically look at recurring bottlenecks and congestion. And so we focus more on the workdays. And then we go through a process of quality control the data. We look at it from different angles, and we ground truth it as well with different engineers within our team, so that we can make sure that the data is the result is something that we have experience through our work. And this is a list of chart of performance metrics. On the left are the different metrics that we compile, and then we have what we compile it at a sub-corridor level, and then we aggregate it up to the corridor level, and then we also report it at the regional level for some performance measures as well. And we use INRIX speed and volume from what I described earlier to derive at certain performance measures. For instance, VHT requires both the speed and the volume, and same as VHD. This is a heat map that we produce, and we love this because it allows us to ground truth the data. Sometimes, you know, when you look at data through a table or some format that's not that's more just data oriented, but it's kind of nice to be able to look at it on a graphical level and compare it to that data. And so this is a heat map of I-205 southbound in 2019, the average weekday speed. And you can locate where each bottleneck is located, the extent of the hours of duration, the queue length, and also the intensity of that bottleneck. And so this allows us to get at a few measures, and also it just really is a good way for us to present it visually to certain audience. And then with all the data that we compile and analyze, we also have this map that we like to use, which is to really show the bottleneck locations and the extent of where they are. And so I'll go back one slide. So how are we using all this data? Basically, we're using it as a basis for us to identify the needs on our system, and then it also helps us to prioritize projects or studies. And we have various work that we've done over this past couple years, and of course you've probably seen a lot of our work, the bigger projects like our tolling study, our I-5 Roads Corridor, our I-205 improvement project, and then we also have the bus on shoulder, and all those data, all those projects basically has some kind of data to support it, to help them in various stages. And so this work that we're doing supports that. And just to demonstrate, one project is our CBOS 2. I don't know why. Our CBOS 2 project. CBOS is for Corridor Bottleneck Operation Study, and it is to the objective of that study is to generate a menu of cost-effective operation improvement for the Portland area freeway system. And we usually provide the team with the work that we've already done with the traffic performance study as a way to give them the data at the corridor level and at the sub-corridor level, so that they have something to start with in terms of identifying locations that have bottlenecks, locations that have safety issues, and just the general knowledge about our system and the performance. And then from there, the project team develops the alternative improvement concepts. And from those concepts, we further refine it, and based on the feasibility criteria, it depends on the cost and the ability to implement the project. And that concludes our presentation. We're now open to questions.
Thank you all for presenting. I don't see any questions. I do have a question about 2020. I'm sure we've all seen different traffic changes, but as you were looking at Portland, did you see that there's an increase in traffic in the midday hours versus 2019? Or
well, I should clarify that our 2020 traffic performance report Actually, we look at data that's earlier and then 2020. So 2019 is mainly our focus, and it's titled 2020 so that it was the hope that we would produce the report in 2020 and release it. But due to the pandemic and a lot of other projects took priority over, so then we are just now finishing the report and hope to release it in the next few months. But our focus over this past year to get to the data that you are interested in, which is 2020 data, is in our COVID traffic report, which we presented back in earlier this month or in February. And so there's another link that you can go and see the data on that. And yes, there's been during the pandemic, there has been a shift in traffic, and we think for now that it's a temporary shift, and it's just a matter of time before we, as we collect more data and monitor traffic to see how traffic recovers and what the new normal would be.
We have one more question that came in, and this is for Carrie. Do you have goals for a future of the traffic performance reports, such as different sources of data or potentially additional highways? We do have, I know I timed some highways, but we do have some major highways or that that could be in this report.
Definitely. I think as we look to the future, particularly knowing that our next report would be covering the years 2019 through 2021, we've already been in discussions about how to potentially change the structure of the report, or whether we include different years, or how we present the data, knowing that it's going to include 2020 and the early part of 2021, where we're still seeing these significant impacts on traffic. That said, at this time, we don't have any plans to expand apart from the 6 freeways, although if Chi has any input as to the future of looking at other freeways or other major arterials where we are seeing people divert to avoid the congestion on the freeways, she may have more insight into that.
No, yes, I think the reason why we focus on the freeway is just because the data is so readily there and there's so much of it. And I think as we get more data sources in the future, and as more data becomes available on the arterial system, that would definitely be something that we would consider adding. As you know, with data, the cleaning of the data or the quality control is the biggest time for us. And so when we do look at arterials and you have the signal system and you have, there's just a lot more elements to have to quality control for, and then also to explain for. So, but I do believe that with more improvement and advancement of the data sources, that we will be able to incorporate more of the sources and then analyze the other arterial system.
I think the next question, I'm going to give it to Sean. RIDIS has real-time data, but will RIDIS incorporate the historical counts on ODOT facilities in the future?
There's discussion of that. I don't know that we have plans to do that at this point. And I would ask if that question is coming from inside ODOT or outside ODOT, because I think on the one hand, if you're outside of ODOT and that data is in there, that might make it a lot easier to access. Is that, I wonder if that's the question.
Good question. That is a very good question. I do not know. But I'm sure there are, I'm not outside ODOT is the answer.
Yeah, it's something that we should look at. And I don't know what the additional costs would be or what we'd have to do, but it's something that I think we'll talk about.
If there's any other questions, I'll throw it out there. What other applications of Redis data are typically done at ODA?
What was the last part? Are typically done.
What other applications of Redis data are typically done at ODOT? I know we apply Redis data for traffic signal analysis and looking at, for myself, looking at travel time or the index. What other ones have you guys done for ODOT?
So I have mentioned the COVID traffic monitoring. We have a report that's for the Portland region, and then we have a report that's statewide. And similar to our traffic performance report, which is Portland specific, there is also a statewide report that reports on congestion overview for the state. So those are the two major ones. And I think for us, we also we report data to the Fed. And so we also take data and aggregate it and also report to the Fed. And I think as far as projects, I think every project now that has some type of analysis performance on it will need to have calibration and validation. And so people would pull the data from Redis as part of their travel time or their speed to compare with their model. And so we kind of see a lot of that being used on projects.
There's one other use case I think might be interesting to people is, and this isn't coming from Redis, but it's coming from INRIX. But our ODOT ITS is using the INRIX API to generate travel times for the VMS message boards that tell you this is how many minutes to this destination.
It's all around us, whether we realize it or not. If that is all for the questions, do the
we have a
panelists?
last slide. If questions are done, we actually have a last slide, but if others have questions.
Okay, last question. How long is the ODOT contract with Redis good for? Would there be another round of reassessment of data platforms when this contract expires?
So our contract with Redis is it's an IGA, and it's 10 years in duration. And then it's actually two contracts. It's one with Redis for the platform and the dashboard and everything. And we continually have development and updates to new features. And then we also have another contract, which is you can purchase any data. So if we didn't purchase INRIX data, we could have bought another source of commercial data, but we chose to go with INRIX XD data. So then that is another source that it's a separate contract. And I don't remember how long our contract with INRIX is. I doubt that it's 10 years. I'm just guessing that it's not 10 years, that it's a duration that's less than that.
That's great. Good duration.
Mm-hmm.
I think that is all.
And
for
the reason that it's Yeah, and the reason it's less than 10 years, I think, is so that we can have flexibility if things changes and so that we're not locked in. But I do believe that it's typically in the past when we had the contract with Here Data, I believe that was 3 years, and so it's anywhere, I think, from 2 to 5 years. And so if those are all the questions, I can go into the next slide, which is, these are some helpful links. I think Sean has gone over the RITIS platform earlier. And so you can go here to get to register. And then the second link is the ODOT webpage on RITIS. And I really advise people to go to this because especially if you're new and or not so new and you're intimidated by all the new features, all the different things that are on the platform, just go and watch the videos and kind of learn what how to navigate it. And then these two last links are to Sean's API work, and I think he has some of the coding in GitHub, or anybody that doesn't want to start their code from scratch, you can borrow his. And I think Sean described earlier about who can access this, and so this is just a reminder of that government agencies or consultants working for a government for ODOT, and then also I think university that's working with ODOT. And then one last thing I wanted to mention is we have a RITIS user group that we meet quarterly, and I encourage again everybody that's interested to attend. It's a great way to learn and talk about use cases and sort of you learn from other people's best practice. And so it's just 2 hours typically. In the next one is in June, I believe, and it's a great way to get started and to continue learning. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you all. On behalf of the ITS Subcommittee, I would just like to say thank you to all of our presenters for participating in this workshop and sharing with us amazing information. Now to our participants, if you enjoyed this webinar, consider joining us for our next webinar in May on the adventures of I-5 and I-205 tolling, and our June workshop on innovative applications of ITS from around the country. I'd like to hand it to Maggie if she's there.
Oh, thank you, Ioana. I'd like to thank our amazing sponsors for sponsoring Oregon ITE. Without your support, we wouldn't be able to offer these free webinars to our attendees. So again, we highly appreciate your support. As a reminder, we Oregon ITE and ITE Western District is hosting a series of webinars that focuses on diversity and inclusion. The last session of this series is going to happen tomorrow at noon. If you are interested in this, please feel free to sign up. Besides technical events that we're providing, Oregon ITE is also going to have a virtual happy hour that's going to happen in late April
I know networking is challenging in this time during COVID-19 when everybody's working remotely, but we would be happy to see your faces on the screen, and look for our email announcements for the happy hour in the next few weeks. With that, I'd like to thank everyone that attended today's webinar. Feel free to send us any feedback if you have any. And thank you very much. Have a good evening. We'll see you at one of our next events.